so much, Sarah, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, I'm very excited to talk to you about this incredible book. So let's start with the question that I ask most of the authors that I meet. What type of books did you read as a kid?
Oh man, I read a lot as a kid. I loved the Lemony Snicket series. Even though I know it's controversial, I did love the Harry Potter series, Percy Jackson, and a lot of books that I had to read as a kid that I ended up, I didn't quite understand when I was reading them, like 1984 and, those kinds of, Toni Morrison books that I've reread as an adult, now fully understanding sort of the political underlying, what was underlying it and having a full appreciation for it. So I did read across a lot of different genres, from the classics to fantasy, usually fantasy though.
Yeah, same. Yeah, I love that. Percy Jackson is one of my favorite, series. That was the books that really got me back into reading chapter books when I was stuck on graphic novels for a long time. So I love that you love that too.
Yeah. Oh, and I can't, when you mentioned graphic novels, I did absolutely read manga. I don't know if that's also a part of what did you read as a kid, but 100% manga.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I'm a manga and anime fan myself, so I love that.
Cool.
So what sparked your interest in writing?
Well, I just love storytelling, and it's so interesting because I was talking to my brothers about this. I have two older brothers, and they really got me into this geek stuff, like fantasy, anime, video games, and I realized that there's so many different ways to tell a story. You can tell a story without using a single word, right? So my brothers really loved to draw, and being the littlest in the family and looking up to them, I would say okay, I want to draw too. And I tried to draw my own little comics. Then I realized that even though I really love storytelling, drawing probably wasn't my forte. But I realized that, again, I loved storytelling and I loved reading. So somehow, I guess, just connecting the dots, writing became my mechanism through which I could tell stories. And that was really kind of how I thought about writing in the first place. It was really like a means to an end, where the end is, I want to communicate to people this really cool story. I want people to fall into these stories the way that I fell into, like Naruto or Percy Jackson and those kinds of things. So I just, from the time that I was so little, I just chose writing as a way to get my stories out there.
I love that. That's beautiful. And hearing you talk about all these different ways to create stories actually reminded me of a children's book that I read recently called What If? And it's about this little girl, and she's talking about all the ways that she can create stories, whether it's drawing or creating snowman stories on the earth, drawing things out on in the mud and things like that. So yeah, there's so many different ways to tell stories, and I love that you do that through writing stories, writing books. What's the most surprising thing that you've learned while creating your books?
The most surprising thing, writing books is very much, I think, a journey of self-discovery. For me, when I first started writing and publishing, I was really just writing, not knowing how my work was going to be sort of taken, how people were going to read it. And I didn't really know what I was capable of. I just knew that I wanted to tell cool stories about magical girls or something because I grew up watching Sailor Moon, right? And as I was writing and getting feedback from readers, I realized just how important stories can be and how much it can have an impact on people. And I think I should have known that already because stories have had an impact on me, but just being on the opposite side of it and being the one to tell those stories. And that writing can do so much good, but it can also do harm, right? And that's why we need to be responsible when we're writing as storytellers. I think that was really the surprising thing that I learned, and through doing these kinds of events and teaching writing at Lakehead and talking to students, I just realized that the written word, writing stories, this is how human beings have come to know each other, and it's also how we've come to know ourselves, and it's how we come to relate to each other. So when we are telling those stories, we have to be responsible. We have to think about what we're putting on the page.
Yeah, I think that's a great message. Thank you. That's a really interesting thing to learn. I think you can only learn that once you are in that field of writing and doing things like that. I love that. So I love historical fiction, and in this case it's historical fantasy, which is even better because I'm a fantasy nerd. I love that so much. I actually just did a review for The Door of No Return by Kwame Alexander, and I'm working on a review of Stealing Home by Jay Torres. The problem is, when reading books with diverse characters, history is not always the nicest place for them to live. What inspired you to explore the Victorian time period?
Well, it's exactly what you said, right? It's funny because, I read and loved, Sherlock Holmes. I watched recently Enola Holmes. I know some people might know Cassandra Clare's Clockwork Angel series as well, which is based in the Victorian era. And I love all those stories, and I always loved to sort of picture myself, and I love steampunk as well, like you can tell I'm a huge geek. But the thing is, when I try to picture myself in that time period, I'm always sort of hit with that reality of, okay, but how would people like me actually be treated in that era? And, a lot of my work has had me do a lot of research into this era, into the colonial sort of Victorian imperial era, what was happening in Africa and what was happening across Europe. And it wasn't, it was kind of like my romantic ideas of the 19th century clashing with the reality of things. And so I realized that, with The Bones of Ruin, I wanted to tell a story that can still be fantastical, that people can still immerse themselves in, but that also told the truth about what things were like at that time. So for example, in the early 1800s, there was a woman named Sarah Bartman, who was from South Africa, a Black woman who was taken to Europe, and she was displayed on a human zoo, in London and in Paris. Eventually she died, and this is very gruesome, but her body was dissected, right, and placed in a museum, really up until the 1980s, right, when her own people in South Africa had to, push and push for the French government to allow them to bury her body in her homeland. But human zoos, that was a major practice in the 19th century in terms of, this kind of colonial way of looking at people of color, Africans, Asians, so on and so forth, where they would be put on display in literal zoos, and that happened even up until, the mid-20th century, really. So I really wanted to center those stories, but center them in the way that made sure that we were looking at things through the eyes of a person of color, through the eyes of a Black woman. Usually, people like us are kind of side characters, maybe like, sidekicks. When I was growing up, those were the books that I read, unfortunately. Like, those are the books that were available, right? So I, as a writer now, want to create stories that tell the truth about history, that can still be fun, and that center our perspectives.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And hearing that history is just so awful. And we have this time period, and I love Enola Holmes and Sherlock Holmes, like you said, and the outfits and the gowns and everything like that. But like you said, you got to tell the truth and what it actually was for somebody in that time period. And I think that's really why, and I know that must have been really hard to write about, doing that research and having to be true to that past. And I think that's why a lot of stories are talking about Black history instead, that Black futurism and sci-fi set in the future, because that's unwritten. It could be whatever you want to be, you can have so much freedom, but with this, you are taking, that role to write fantasy in the past, and you're centering diverse characters, which I think is so important. So.
Yeah, and I will say, you mentioned African sort of stories in the future. And I also love Afrofuturism. Like, I'm sure people like Nnedi Okorafor and, Nell Hopkinson. And I think the importance the power of those kinds of stories is imagining that there will be Black people in the future. That in and of itself, I think, is a source of resistance. But there also needs to be an understanding of where we were in the past, of where we are now, and where we could be, and keeping that hope alive.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. So Iris has a memory problem and is driven by the need to find out who she is and where she's from. Why did you feel it was important to have this ongoing theme?
Well, I really wanted, again, Iris was very much inspired by Sarah Baartman. And I thought to myself, what if Sarah Baartman couldn't die? So even after they had dissected her body and put her in a museum, she just regrew her limbs and walked right out of the museum. So kind of like what if we had a certain kind of power that no matter how much they tried to harm us, they couldn't. But I also thought about, what does it mean to be in that position and to try and grapple with history, with your own history, and how difficult that can be. And so Iris has a memory problem, but it's largely because of that trauma that she had in the past, which I can't really talk about because it's a spoiler, but I think it's indicative of the ways in which, this is Black History Month, and what does it mean to excavate those kinds of histories that are very difficult to think about, right? Those collective traumatic histories and memory. And sometimes we don't want to think about it. And I think that's fine for a lot of us, especially for a lot of Black people that might just want to have escapes every once in a while and don't want to think about traumatic histories. But I think it's important to make that present, to remember it, to think about how the present is still past, or how the past is still present, sorry, and what we can do moving forward. So I think Iris's storyline of amnesia is very much sort of parallel to that. It's very much analogous to, people needing to come to terms with the past so that they can move forward into the future.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, we have to look at the past in order to, look forward to the future or not make the same mistakes that we made in the past. I actually did a project with CBC Kids News recently on Black futures. And I spoke to this young girl who, who's doing things in her school community for Black futures and calling it Black Futures Month. And she said that, when she thinks about Black history and she thinks about, all that pain, it makes her really upset. It makes her really mad. So looking towards Black futures is a way for her to, not feel that rage or to take it out or to think of something better than that. So I think that, that's really important. And I like these stories.
I love Black Futures Month. I love that. Let's do it.
Yeah. It's a lot of people, they're doing that in their school community. Their student council is doing an event and an educational video and making pins and buttons and things like that. So it's really cool. The world building in this world is amazing. Adam Temple kind of gives me a Bones of Ruin type vibe, or not Bones of Ruin, Shadow and Bone type vibe. Yeah. And the Tournament of Freaks is very dark, but somehow still exciting. How did you go about mapping out this world and how you're going to explore it?
Wow, well, I always start, first of all, with, what is it that I want to say with the story? I always feel like a story needs to have a point to it. And that doesn't mean that it has to be like didactic or heavily, moral, but just a point. What is it that you want to say with the story? And that becomes like the skeleton of the story. You know how we can't stand up without our skeletons. We just be like bags of flesh. But once you have the skeleton there, then you can have everything else, right? And so I sort of see the point of the story as the skeleton. Everything else, the characters, the world building, the plot, can kind of revolve around that point once you have it. So once I thought about the fact that I really wanted to excavate some of those buried histories in the 19th century of people of color and colonized people that our stories often aren't told, especially in that time period. And I know there's a lot of people that are still like, there were, Black people and Asian people in Britain in the 19th century. And I was like, yes. So it's like, once I did that, I started to world build around that. And I started to think about like, a community of people that were marginalized in some way through race, gender, sexuality, class, all those things, that had suddenly been given these magical powers. And how would they be used? You know, and that's where I came up with the Enlightenment Committee, where you have this very, you know, secretive group of, you know, rich, very rich, wealthy, powerful white people that are like, well, we know that there are these empowered, magically empowered people. We're going to use them to our advantage. And we're going to give them things that they can't, you know, resist, right? In this case, the people who win the tournament of freaks, even though it's a tournament to the death, will be given, you know, riches, you know, they'll never have to worry about their lives. So it's kind of like taking advantage of these impoverished people or these marginalized people. And so from there, it was just about asking myself why, which is what I always do when it comes to world building. Why do they have powers? How did they get it? And once you are able to answer those questions, then hopefully you'll be able to have a foundation of a world that's immersive enough to be believable, even if it's, you know, extravagantly magical.
Yeah, I love that. And I mean, this is a historical fiction, obviously, but I think that like, how do you go about doing all that research and things like that to, you know, help make this world and make sure that it's as accurate as possible while still being, you know, a fantasy?
The library. So thank you to Hamilton Public Library, and watching documentaries as well. I watched a lot of National Geographic. It took a lot of reading books, reading nonfiction, historical books, to get a sense of what, you know, 19th century Britain was like in terms of what did people wear, what were the class differences, and digging a little deeper to try and learn stories about people of color in various communities. And after that, it was just a matter of seeing how I could sort of absorb that into the storytelling. But that's why places like the library matter so much, because even when I was doing like my dissertation at Mac, I was largely like, if not at the McMaster, you know, libraries, but I was in the public libraries here doing a lot of that kind of important work and research.
Yeah, I mean, whenever I come to the library to, you know, sit down and do work on my laptop, whether it's for school or whatever I'm doing, I'm just like, wow, I understand why people come to the library on their laptops. It's because, you know, usually before, when I was younger, I just come here to, you know, go play on the computers and go play in the little playroom and things like that. But just the environment is so great for, you know, getting in that headspace to actually do work. So, thank you, library. So I don't have my copy of Songs of Wrath yet, which is the second book. So can you tell me, you know, I'm sure some people in the audience are going to rush to buy Bones of Ruin or borrow a copy. Without any spoilers for me and them, can you tell me a bit about it and how it continues Iris' story?
Well, the one thing that I want to talk about is, has anyone actually seen The Woman King, that movie? Or know about it? So Viola Davis is a Dahomey Amazon, they called them, but actually they're called the Mino or the Agoji. And the Dahomey Kingdom at that time was a powerful African nation in West Africa. And now I think it's called, it's present day Benin. So that's what the country is called now. But it was a big, powerful nation in the 19th century, in the late 19th century. And one of the characters in the Bones of Ruin actually hails from that kingdom. But her history is very complicated. And through this character named Rin, you actually get to see a lot of that complicated history in terms of the Dahomey Kingdom and its relationship with neighboring African kingdoms like the Yoruba Kingdom, and which I am from, and other places like that. And we actually get to go to the Dahomey Kingdom in the Song of Wrath, book 2 of the Bones of Ruin trilogy. That was really fun in terms of doing the research for that, but also contending with the history that I feel is empowering, you know, like the warriors, the Dahomey Amazons were like an all-female warrior group. like an all-female military regiment, which is really cool. And I think the Marvel, if anyone's seen Black Panther, that military group was based off of them. So that's really awesome to think about. But there's also like some really negative parts of that history and some difficult parts in terms of their part in the slave trade, not just the transatlantic slave trade, but slave trading within Africa. So there's a lot of that I talk about in the book. And it's really about thinking of humanity and some of the, where we've been and whether or not that has to determine where we'll go in the future. Because we've hurt each other. I think if you look at history, there's a lot of violence and there's a lot of, history of people hurting each other. I try to contend with that. But through this trilogy, I'm also trying to think about if we can imagine something different, then where can we go in the future?
Wow, I'm really excited. That sounds great. I cannot wait to get my hands on it, so thank you. And yeah, I was reading the Effigy series over there. I was reading the synopsises. That looks really cool. Can you tell us a bit about that one too?
Well, the Effigy series was my first series with Simon & Schuster, and it's so geeky. Like, really, I came up with it because when I heard that Sailor Moon was getting a reboot called Sailor Moon Crystal, which I think is almost done now, and I was thinking about, wouldn't it be cool if, there were kids that were kind of like celebrities, they were kind of like Sailor Moon and the Sailor Senshi, but everybody knew who they were, so it was kind of like they were part-time Instagram influencers and part-time superheroes. And so that's kind of what it's about. You have these 4 girls with the power of the elements, and they're super empowered, and they fight these creatures called the phantoms. And society has since adapted to the phantoms, like they've created cities and technology in order to protect people, but they still need the effigies. So you have these teenage girls with these magical powers, but at the same time, they're also celebrities. Everybody knows who they are. They're in the spotlight. They have all these Instagram fans and things like that. But there's also, the issues that come with that, that you're held to such a high standard that if you screw up once, people will tear you down, even though you're just a teen girl, right? And just what does it mean to be in the public eye and to have all that pressure as a young girl? So I wrote that thinking that hopefully there are young girls that will be able to relate to that, and that we can ask ourselves questions in terms of how do we feel about empowered young girls? I think society sometimes likes to lift them up, but also tear them down, right? And how do we protect our young girls, right? Who have that kind of, who are in a position where they have so much responsibility, on their shoulders. So hopefully people will read it, even just for the butt kicking and the fantasy action scenes and things like that as well.
Well, I love that. I mean, I know I'm definitely going to read it now, so thank you. I'm very, very excited. Okay, now I know you're an anime and manga fan like myself. This is really just a question for me. I was wondering if you had any recommendations.
Oh man. I want to take it back to because everyone, they're watching Attack on Titan and Demon Slayer and things like that. But my favorite all-time anime is a 90s anime called Vision of Escaflowne. And it's, everyone's like, yeah, right. It's 26 episodes, and it's this isekai kind of story. And isekai basically means that it's a portal fantasy, kind of like Narnia. And this young girl gets sucked into this high fantasy world. And she has to sort of come to terms with herself. So it's very much like a Bildungsroman, coming of age for her. But there's also, this fantasy world that's at war. So she has to come to terms with, how does she sort of make a difference in this war? And of course, there's 2 cute love interests, of course, and there's lots of, great adventure and fantasy, great action sequences, romance. It has everything. And I think, it was just instrumental for me growing up in figuring out the kinds of epic storytelling that I want to tell as well. So Vision of Escaflowne, everybody please watch that if you haven't already.
All right, sounds good. That sounds really interesting. I mean, I'm watching Blue Lock right now, the new episode came out at 2, so I gotta go catch up. Yeah, exactly what I need to do. Okay, so I have a would you rather question before we get into the Q&A. Would you rather Bones of Ruin was made into an anime or a TV series or movie?
That's super tough. I'm gonna say anime. It's because you know what? It's a lot of my story ideas are very big, and I almost feel like you need a lot of money to get like the CG right and things like that. And I think that a really well done anime with great animation and art could just make it come alive. And I just finished my Avatar: The Last Airbender rewatch, so I was like, yes, I want this.
Yes, that's great. Yeah, I love that. And I would love to see that. I think I would also love to see it as like a live action movie.
Yeah. I wouldn't say no to live action. I wouldn't say so. If any Hollywood producers are watching this, not just back, I would not say no to the live action.
All right, sounds good. I'm excited. I really hope that it becomes one of those. So yeah, thank you. I think I'm gonna hand it off if anybody has any questions for Sarah. Oh yeah.
That's a good question. That's actually a that gets to the heart of everything, right? Like, why do you want to make a book? And I just loved storytelling, but there's so many different ways to storytell, like I say. And, you know, there are writers that just kind of write for themselves. Like maybe they write little stories on, you know, in their journals or for Instagram or something. Writing a book is a whole different beast, but I always loved as a kid walking into a library or a bookstore and holding that physical copy of a book. And I just loved the idea of a physical copy of something that I've written myself being available for other people. So that all my books are over there and you can hold them in your hands. And there's just something so magical about that. So that's why I decided that, you know what, I'm gonna try and write books, like not just write stories for myself or keep them to myself, but I'm gonna try and actually write books so that hopefully one day I can walk into a library or walk into a bookstore and pull it out of their shelves and hold it.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
How do you start a story?
How do I start a story? Oh, that's also a very good question. I just get inspired by things. Like, what are the things that you like to do that are just fun for you? Yeah. Oh, you like crafts and things like that? Okay. Well, sometimes when you're making things, you might get inspired to do something else. Like some people might like to run, or they might like to do crafts. They might like to read books. They might like to swim. I see there's a very nice, pool over there. And while you're doing those kinds of activities, you might just get inspired because those activities put you in they make you happy, right? Like when you're doing those kind of activities that you love, they make you happy, they make you peaceful, they make you calm, and that's when really good story ideas come to you. At least that's what it does for me. So that's really how I start, is just being inspired by something. And then I just think about, okay, now that I have a really cool idea because I was inspired, where can I go with this? What do I want to say with this story? Then I think about characters and plot and, world building. Is this going to be a fantasy story? Or is it going to be a historical story? Or both? That kind of thing. But it always starts with that spark of inspiration.
What's your favorite book that you've written?
Sorry.
What's your favorite book that you've written so far?
Oh man, it's hard to choose, but you know what? I just finished, I just submitted the last book of the Bones of Ruin trilogy to my editor, and I can't say, what the title is or anything like that, but I actually cried when I finished it because I felt like I can't believe I pulled this off. So, and my editor was like, this is so great, and she loved it, and you know, when you're a writer, you kind of have ups and downs in your career and sometimes with your self-esteem. But when I finished the trilogy, I realized how far I've come from when I started writing to where I am now. So that's why I kind of shed a few tears. And so I'll say that that third book that I just submitted is my favorite book so far, but I love them all.
Do you see yourself in the characters of your book? Because your storylines are really accurate and intense. So is it that you transform into the main character and how you would like to see that particular storyline change based on your perspective? Yes, you are mirroring an actual person who was disenfranchised in that way. But are you trying to say, okay, if you were that person, this with my magical powers, this is how it would have ended up? So are you your own muse?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that yes and no. And I'm going to say yes and no because I think all of my characters have to have a little bit of me in them because they're coming out of my head. With the main character, it is a little bit of what would I do or what do I want to see. So there's a little bit of me, but I also have to remember that this character isn't me. That this character has to be her own sort of, her own creation, her own person. I don't want her to be like a self-insert, as they would say. Like sometimes, authors might self-insert themselves into the character, and it ends up being kind of like a Mary Sue story or something like that. Rather than that, I want to picture these characters as being their own people, wholly separate from me, but not completely separate. They still have part of me in them, and through that character, especially the main character, there's still going to be aspects of my philosophy. I love little kids. There's still going to be aspects of my philosophy because, it's through that character that I'm telling the story of what I would like to see happen throughout history, right? So Iris is based off of Sarah Bartman, What If? Like, what if Sarah Bartman didn't have to go through what she went through? So just by that alone, she has a little bit of me, a little bit of my wishes in her, but she's still her own character. Thank you for that question.
Right. Do you have any social media address where people can contact you with their ideas for books?
Well, I have a website. So sarahraughley.com is literally just my name, sarahraughley.com. And you can use the contact form. I also have Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, which I'm trying to keep up with social media, but there's just a lot of, it feels like a separate job sometimes. And also like with Twitter and Elon Musk taking it over and all this stuff, I've just been like, I don't know if I want to stay on this app, but I still communicate with people who communicate with me. So my all of my Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok handles are at S_Raughley. So at S_RAUGHLEY. Or you can just type my name into like a Google search and you'll find all of my social media and my website. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you. Hi there.
Hi.
So I'm always looking for literature for young adults, and I'm wondering why you picked that form. I'm also seeing a lot of Nigerian voices, strong female characters, women of color who take the lead in the stories, and I'm just wondering why you chose YA.
Thank you. I think, I'm trying to think about what it is about YA that attracts me to it. And I think it's a multi-layered answer because on one hand, a lot of the stuff that really inspired me during my formative years were YA or middle grade, right? Like they were books for youth. And those formative years kind of made me who I am in terms of the kind of stories that I love to consume. So that's why I kind of write stories like that as well. But I actually think that the young adult market allows for the kind of storytelling that I'm doing. That when it comes to, adult fantasy, for example, it's a little harder to have, first of all, Black women in sort of centered, to get that through the door. Whereas editors and young adults in the young adult market are looking for that. In the middle grade market, they're looking for that. In the adult market, it's a little bit harder, right? And I also want things like, the kind of romance that I want to do that's romantic and loving, but not so, there's kids here, so I don't want to say, but, adult romance tends to, it's almost like the market mandates certain things for certain markets. So if there's romance in adult, they expect it to be, I'll say, very spicy. whereas like, I don't necessarily want to write that. Whereas for middle grade, they expect it to be a certain kind of, like they expect it to not be there and stuff like that. So I just feel like young adult, the market allows for the kind of storytelling that I want to do in terms of the kind of characters, the kind of world building, the kind of, politics, the kind of epic plots, and also the kind of romance that I want to do. Young adult just allows for the kind of vision that I have to come to fruition.
Now, are you hoping that young girls will see that and use that role modeling to inspire them to maybe become writers or read more fiction, or do you have a goal that's oriented towards your audience as well?
Well, I think my goal in writing is just to tell stories because I love telling stories. So even if nobody read them, I would still want to tell stories for myself because I have stories and I just need to get them out there. I think it's wonderful as well that young people are reading it. If I can inspire someone to be a writer, then that's like mission accomplished kind of a thing because I know the writers, the storytellers that inspired me to be a writer, right? And that I owe a debt to. And at the same time, in terms of like role models, I don't always tell stories where the main character is meant to be a role model. And I think that's important as well, especially for young women, because I think there are so many, like I mentioned before, young women are held to impossible standards sometimes. And there's always a sense that you can't make mistakes, you can't have weaknesses, you can't grow, you can't this and that. And I'm like, well, what if you tell a story about a young Black girl who's like kind of villainous, right? Like that would be awesome. And I'm kind of doing that. Like, don't tell anybody, but I'm kind of doing that for some of my next projects. But they don't necessarily need to be role models, but maybe they need to show that Black women and women of color can be different types of people and can inhabit different types of roles and still be awesome. So maybe that would inspire young women as well. Like, oh, I don't have to be like perfect and, doing the right thing all the time. I can make mistakes. I don't have to be held to these bourgeois standards of morality either, right? So, I always write, first of all, to satisfy myself. But if I can, inspire others, then that's always a beautiful bonus.
I think that's great, that realism factor, and not making the characters perfect. And I think that really speaks to a lot of young people today, that duality or the different aspects, that you can be many things. Yeah. You don't have to just be one thing.
Oh, absolutely. And especially I'll just say, like, with social media, I know that it's a lot tougher these days. Like, the pressure is just a lot. Like, I'm sure you can speak to this more than I do. Like, I was not really on social media when I was a teen, but the pressure to be a certain ideal for others and to be a role model and to adhere to a kind of image, whether it's body image or whatever else kind of image, it can sometimes feel immense. So, if I can do a little bit to lower the pressure a little bit and let people know that, we're still human and we can make mistakes and this and that, Absolutely, I mean that's an honor for me to be able to help people in that way.
Can you recommend any publishers or that kind of thing to people on your website or stuff?
Publishers, like for people who want to publish, people who want to write. I could, but I think that it's probably better to go to those like websites that are geared towards helping writers become writers. Like there's a site called, I haven't really been on these sites for a while, but I know there's a site called Manuscript Wishlist or MS Wishlist that has a list of agents and editors from different publishing houses that they will tell you straight up what they're looking for. And that they're looking for, certain agents and certain publishers are only looking for, young adult books, or they're only looking for adult, or some editors, they don't touch fantasy, or they only do fantasy, that kind of thing. So if you go to MS Wishlist, and you can even just Google that, and you'll find a great resource for all the publishers that are out there. There are also a lot of Canadian publishers. Sometimes it's just a matter of, if you love reading, take a look at who published that book that you just finished, right? So if you love reading a young adult book and you just finished a great young adult book, take a look at, the spine of the book, and you'll see who the publisher is and who the imprint is. And then just Google and take a look at, who are the editors there. Maybe if you have a favorite author, who edits, that person's author, or that person. And then maybe that's somebody you might want to look into, or who is that author's agent. And then you can write all those things down and build a database for yourself. That's how I did it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
One last question.
Yep.
Do you think your studies say that you reached PhD level that encouraged you to sustain the self-motivation to write a book of such a volume? I don't want to be an author, but the task of putting down your ideas, blossoming it into chapters and editing it, and it seems to me, since this is not my area, like a real challenge. How do you stay motivated? Was there a course in your studies that helped you plan how authors should think?
That's a good question. It's interesting because I teach, so I'm an assistant professor of writing at Lakehead University, the Aurelia campus, and I teach creative writing classes now. But when I was a student at McMaster, I only took one creative writing course, and there wasn't like this big, or maybe they did have like a master's of fine arts or something like that, but I really just took regular English classes. So I didn't get to take any class that helped me figure out how to write a book. I kind of had to figure that out on my own. But at the same time, I think through writing essays, and you start off writing essays that are only 500 words, and then maybe 1,000 words, and then maybe 1,500 words, and then maybe 2,500 words, and so on and so forth. And you don't realize it, but you're actually training yourself. You're training yourself to get an idea down and to write it and to finish it. And you're training yourself to, figure out time management, so to give yourself enough time to go through that process. And as you go up in years and get into grad school and things like that, you're writing longer works. And you realize that, wait, I can handle writing, a 3,000 word essay. I can do that in like a day or 2 days, whereas before it would take me like a week to write a 500 word essay, right? Like I'm training myself step by step by step. So it was actually through going through that process of training, right? And learning how to write essays that got longer and longer and longer and longer until they were like, a 50 page or 200 something page dissertation. But it was while I was training to do that I figured out how to transfer those skills to my creative writing. So it is really the same kind of steps where you sit down, you figure out the time that you have, you manage your time. When can you write? When do you have to take care of, your family or your friends and other things like that? And how do you finish? How do you stay motivated? It's really a lot of the same stuff. So I think even though I didn't have any formal training in how to write a creative book, I think a lot of the work that I did in undergrad in the English department really helped me learn how to sit down and write something that's coherent and to finish it. And finishing is the most important thing, because a lot of people can start writing books, but they don't finish. And if you don't finish, then you don't have a book. If you don't have a book, then you can't publish it, so.
All right, I think this will be our last question. So sci-fi and fantasy kind of have a history of just kind of having no barriers. Like some of the earliest sci-fi writers were women. The first interracial kiss was on Star Trek. So I'm wondering if you feel like that this genre is kind of easier to write for those kinds of topics. There's less expectation, there's less barriers, less restriction. You just kind of write whatever you want to write without worrying about it fitting in or approaching those sensitive topics.
That's a really interesting question. I think it's important that we kind of look at the history of sci-fi and the potential of sci-fi. So speculative fiction, absolutely, it is, your imagination is the limit, right? The limit is the sky, or whatever they say. I don't know what that saying is, but as long as you can imagine it, you can write it. And that's what sci-fi and fantasy allows for. But I will say historically, when we look at the Western history of how science fiction and fantasy, especially science fiction, kind of arose out of sort of the 19th century, that kind of period of frenzied imperialism, at the time that the novel was also becoming sort of part of the leisure space of middle-class Victorian homes. It was largely made by and for white middle-class homes. And so people of color were largely sort of came in as, through the lens of colonialism, right? There's all kinds of research that I've looked into as well, just for my academic stuff, but in terms of how sci-fi and the history and the evolution of sci-fi is very tied to imperialism. So if you read H.G. Wells, for example, and how, these others were sort of looked at and classified, and a lot of that came from how these white writers were looking at the colonial other, right? And how they understood otherness to be was largely through that lens. And so you do have a lot of tropes that are coming out of a very problematic history, which kind of goes against what speculative fiction can be. That speculative fiction can actually challenge a lot of these, mainstream tropes that are buried in these colonial histories. And so I think that when you mentioned Star Wars and the first interracial kiss, that was Star Trek, sorry. I just take my geek card now, sorry. But when you think about that, it's there was a specific, the writers wanted to push back against the kind of stuff that they were seeing, that they had grown up with, that had been in the history of sci-fi. And there were a lot of people that loved that interracial kiss. At the time, it was very controversial, right? But nowadays, we are, a lot of people, whether they're white, whether they are, marginalized, racially marginalized, whether they are queer, whether they are, differently abled, neurodivergent, they are starting to really take speculative fiction where it can go. The potential that it always had, which is to challenge the status quo. And I think that's what I want to do as a writer, because you can use science fiction and speculative fiction to speak on reality and to speak on history and to speak on, present day issues, or you can use it to completely escape and to create a utopia. something where you don't have to, where Black people don't have to be traumatized and various things like that, right? You can do all of that within a speculative space, which is why I love it so much. And I just love that, it's been mentioned already that there are a lot of Nigerian authors out there that are writing and bringing in, Afrocentric, myths and ways of thinking and things like that. But I think it just goes to show that speculative fiction is a playground for the other, whereas before we were kind of like, the object to be studied and looked at and scrutinized, and now we're kind of the ones telling the stories. Yeah, we can tell. I mean, the sky is really the limit in terms of what you can do with speculative fiction. You just have to be able to imagine it. So if you're not limited, then your work won't be limited either. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, great. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Sarah, for joining me today. I think that this was such a lovely conversation, and loved all the questions from everybody. That was amazing.
Thank you so much for being a great host, and I'm so excited for all the stuff you have coming up.
Well, thank you. Everyone, make sure to check out all of Sarah's books. You can follow me on Instagram at Ainara's Bookshelf. I also have a TV series on TVO, Ainara's Bookshelf. That's available on Thursdays and Saturdays at 6:24. So,
yeah. And you can find me at sarahrawley.com, and all of my socials will be there.
thank you so much, everybody.